African history, the Fashoda crisis or incident, 1898. The Fashoda crisis/incident, 1898. The Fashoda crisis was an international clash which occurred between two European imperial powers, namely Britain and France, in Africa Sudan on the River Nile at a sandbank called Fashoda. French forces which had advanced from the Upper Congo were led by French explorer Major J.B. Marchand. The British forces which advanced from Egypt were under the command of Lord Kitchener. In 1898, Lord Kitchener faced Marchand at Fashoda and forced him to withdraw. This provoked the Fashoda incident, which nearly led to war between Britain and France. Indeed, it was Paris, being mindful of the British naval power in Europe, that saved the situation by ordering the withdrawal of Marchand's forces from Fashoda. While the British and the French nearly went to war for a mere sandbank at Fashoda can be explained by a number of factors. In the first instance was the Egyptian question. In 1882, the British occupied Egypt and consequently ejected the French. But to Egypt was the Nile and the Nile was Egypt. As such, Britain was interested in controlling all countries through which the Nile flowed and determined to fight off any threats along the Nile, be it France. At the same time, the French were disappointed in losing Egypt and desired to compensate for the loss and possibly injure the interests of the British by controlling Sudan, through which the Nile flowed. At the same time, in 1883, a French professor prompted reasoned in a lecture that the Nile would one time change its course of flow. To be secure in Egypt, it was therefore significant that they control the whole Nile. Hence, when the French appeared at Fashoda, they almost went to war with the British, all arising from the strategic importance of the sandbank. The British and the French almost went to war because of the economic potential of the area. Fashoda was economically significant in relation to the Nile and the Asian British Empire. It was also important in terms of communication and transport. At the same time, the Sudan was rich, or anticipated to be rich, in terms like ivory, timber and gold. Britain was so determined to defend her economic interests along the whole Nile Valley, while the French were also interested in the same. This set the two ablink of war at Fashoda in 1898. There was also pressure from other imperial European powers scrambling for African territory. For instance, Leopold Roman II of the Congo aimed at creating a vast empire from the Congo eastward to Zanzibar, but without clearly defining its northern limit. The Germans and the Italians were also advancing towards the Nile. These advances threatened the British and the French in a rush for the Sudan, thereby triggering off the Fashoda crisis. Alongside the European imperial forces was the Ethiopian threat. Menelik Roman II had clearly indicated that he was interested in Sudan. His threat became more substantial after the Adwa victory of 1896 over the Italians. This victory had shown that Menelik had the capacity to overrun the Sudan. As such, Britain and France had to rush for the Sudan lost. It goes to Menelik. After the alliance against the British interests in the region, for France was then on good terms with Menelik XI. This possible alliance would be dangerous to the British imperial interests because, using Ethiopia and Sudan, France would antagonize British interests in Egypt, the Red Sea and the Far East. Britain also had another excuse. Britain claimed the Sudan as being its property, first because Gordon had died there in 1885. The argument was that the blood of a British national had been shed in Sudan, therefore Britain had the right to control the Sudan. France, on its part, wanted to link the West African and Equatorial Africa possessions to Africa so as to create a powerful commercial empire. Since Sudan was the missing link, it was important that if need be, force had to be applied as the only alternative for that territory to fulfill French commercial interests. African history, the Fashoda crisis or incident, 1898. For the French at this time was trying to recover her international prestige after the 1870 defeat by Prussia. In that humiliation, France lost her iron and coal provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. At this period of the scramble and partition of Africa, when the nation's glory was measured in terms of the extent of her empire, France had to try and score victory in this field. But in her bid to do so, France ended up clashing with the British at Fashoda. Perhaps most important for France was the fact that she was threatened by the ambitious colonial program of Britain, which aimed at the creation of the Cape to Cairo Empire. Such a plan, if successful, would make Britain too powerful and France an underdog in international affairs. There was therefore that great urge to control the Sudan if Britain was to be checked. After all, if the French established themselves in the Sudan, it would be possible to revenge the 1882 British treachery when France was outdone in Egypt. However, this resulted into a clash in interests leading to the incident. It may be useful to know that Britain and France almost went to war at Fashoda in 1898 because of the encouragement given by the German Kaiser William. The Kaiser promised France that Germany would not interfere in the crisis. Moreover, Germany at that time was on bad terms with Britain after the 1895 conflict in the Jamestown raid, when the Kaiser supported the war against the British. It has also been suggested that the Fashoda crisis was part of the long-term Anglo-French international rivalry. France and Britain had long conflicted since the American War of Independence of 1776, the Napoleonic Egyptian Campaign of 1897, the Continental System, and so on. Thus it is possible to argue that the French and the British had all scores to settle that were just replayed at Fashoda in 1898. The Fashoda crisis did not erupt into open war. It was solved diplomatically when the French gave in to British demands and the British reciprocated. At the same time, Britain and France could not confront each other in Africa at Fashoda for fear of the consequences of war. This was because if Europeans became war-weary on the African continent, the Africans would possibly easily unite against them. Moreover, in 1885 at the Berlin Conference, European powers had agreed never to go to war over African possessions and to solve the differences diplomatically, not by military commanders but by foreign ministers. Indeed, the two foreign ministers of Britain and France met in Paris in 1898 and agreed to withdraw their forces from Fashoda. Britain was to control the Sudan and France was given a free hand in the Maghreb region and French Somaliland. It has also been suggested that Britain and France did not go to war at Fashoda because France still had the memories of the Franco-Russian War of 1870. France did not therefore want to create another enemy in Europe. Britain in addition to Germany. Besides, on the ground, the French forces under Major Merchant were relatively fewer as compared to large and well-armed forces under the British General Lord Kitchener. Yet by the Fashoda African history, the Fashoda crisis or incident, 1898. Without River Nile waters, there is no life in Egypt. The desire for Britain to bring the whole of the Nile Valley states under her control led to Fashoda crisis. Fashoda had less economic prospect, but she was of great importance to European colonialists. It was part of the Nile, the control of which by other rival powers would affect life in Egypt by tampering with the flow of the Nile waters, hence polarizing the British interests. The pressure from other scrambling powers was another cause, like from Congo area. Leopold XI aimed at creating a big empire from Congo eastwards to Zanzibar without limiting its northern extent. This threatened the British and French, which caused the rush to go and occupy Sudan. There was also pressure from other European powers, especially Italy and Germany, that had just emerged out of unification and wanted colonies on the African continent. Furthermore, it is stated that Britain was trying to revenge for the death of Charles Gordon during the Modest Revolt and decided to reconquer Sudan in 1898. British public argued that Gordon was a martyr who had gone to Sudan on humanitarian mission and therefore need to revenge against Sudan by reconquering it, hence outcompeting it from the hands of Frenchmen. On top of this, Britain had declared protectorate over Uganda in 1894 and Kenya also had been colonized in 1895. Britain was already in control of the source of the Nile and the French advance to Sudan was considered a threat to their interests. The Franco-Congolese Agreement of 1894 was also responsible for Fashoda incident. By this agreement, France was to go ahead and occupy Bahr el-Ghazal in the Upper Nile Valley. As a result of this agreement, Captain Merchant advanced expeditions to occupy the southern Sudan. This incident was a result of French disappointment upon losing Egypt. They wanted to compensate for the loss of Britain by taking control of Sudan, through which the Nile waters flow. Britain and France had for long been enemies alike. In 1882, Britain unnecessarily occupied Egypt in a complete disregard of the French interest in the Suez Canal and Egypt. In 1879, Britain supported Portuguese claims over the Congo in order to block the advance in the area. France had grievances against Britain arising from the British refusal to help France in Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. During the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, Britain had supported Leopold's claims over Congo, leading to the formation of Congo Free State under Leopold XI, which culminated into the calling of Berlin Conference. Hence, by 1896, Fashoda incident had a number of accumulated facts of enmity between France and Britain. Britain had stood on the way of all French designs ever since the Napoleonic period. Since then, the sanctions of the continental system, Britain and France had mistrusted one another in the field of trade and politics. On the African continent, there were threats exerted to Ethiopia under Menelik XI after defeating Italians in 1896. After this year, Ethiopia became a threat to European colonizers, and worse still, Menelik XI openly stated his intention is to participate in the scramble of neighboring states like Sudan. Even years before this relationship. African history, the Fashoda crisis or incident, 1898. Some scholars argue that this incident could have resulted from the ambitiousness of the two men, i.e., Captain Merchant and Lord Kitchener. This was because Frenchmen in Africa wanted to revenge for the loss of Egypt and reassert the French political glory in Africa. By 1898, Britain had begun a formal move to colonization of Africa. She was no longer interested in informal colonies. In South Africa, Cecil Rhodes had developed a plan to paint Africa red. From Cape Province to Cairo. The French advance to Sudan was therefore to block this plan. The consequences of the Fashoda crisis. In 1898, a stable government was established in Sudan and resistance in all quarters crushed. confidence was restored by fixing low taxes, land reforms were carried out and titles of land were registered. Schools and communications were established, and by 1914 firm boundaries of Sudan with Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia and Zaire were agreed. At the end of the crisis, Sudan was declared a British colony. Both Britain and Egypt were to govern Sudan as their colony. This led to the rise of condominium government in Sudan until 1956. The condominium joint formed governments and control of the state was an Anglo-Egyptian administration where the Queen of Britain and Khedive of Egypt jointly governed Sudan. The interests of Britain in Khartoum were looked after by Governor-General assisted by many British governors. The first Governor-General was Sir Herbert Kitchener. He ruled Sudan until 1899 when he went to East Africa on the outbreak of the Second Anglo-Boer War for enforcement. He was succeeded by Reginald Wingate. France lost Sudan to Britain, thus its dreams of extending its African bloc of territories to Somaliland flopped. It turned out its colonial intentions to end African states and concentrated on its African colonies. The Fashoda crisis was a big diplomatic victory for Britain. It showed to the world that the British were not only powerful economically but also militarily. This was one of the most serious humiliations the Third French Republic was faced with. It led to the spread of Christianity in Sudan. Though Turco-Egyptians had introduced Christianity in Sudan, it had not spread quickly and widely because of deep-rootedness of Islam. The 1898 condominium government led to the growth of Christianity, most especially in the southern Sudan. This was because British administrators were mainly Christians. It marked the beginning of conflicts between the southern Christians and northern Muslims. It contributed to the colonization of large parts of West Africa and French Somaliland by France. This was because in conclusion of this crisis, Captain Merchant and General Kitchener agreed to solve their differences. African history, the Fashoda crisis or incident, 1898. Loss of lives on the side of Sudan due to weak arms. They had carried muskets and spears to fight against cannon fire Maxim guns and repeater rifles. Many of the Sudanese Khalifa's forces died at Kordofan. Indirect rule system was introduced in Sudan by Anglo-Egyptian government. Local chiefs were employed, but those received orders from above where the top posts were dominated by British and Egyptians. In the army and civil service, the British were at the top with the post of the Governor-General as the head of the army being held by Britain throughout the condominium government. In social sector, Christianity was encouraged, health services put up and the British type of education was introduced. Indeed, in 1902, Gordon Memorial School was established. It began as a primary school and had become a secondary school by 1905. While the French withdrew from Fashoda, the French government recognized the right of Great Britain and Egypt to rule Sudan. In return, Great Britain recognized the right of France to her West African claims, and with this, France saw no reason of fighting a dangerous war. France had long time of misfortunes at the hands of other powers. During Napoleonic era, France had suffered humiliation under Britain, and it was too soon for France to have recovered from 1870 losses. France was conscious of British superiority and she did not want to risk war against her. The French expedition under Captain Merchant was in no way comparable to the Anglo-Egyptian force under Lord Kitchener. It was numerically inferior and did not have as many arms and supplies as the Anglo-Egyptian force. The Anglo-Egyptian force could easily get supplies from Egypt and from the British bases of the Mediterranean. African history, the Fashoda crisis or incident, 1898.